Welcome back, dear listeners, the podcast that delves into the spine-chilling corners of the unknown. I'm your host, Doctor. Dark and tonight's story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about suburban life. Ghosts, spirits, and vengeful entities. Are they confined to abandoned mansions, desolate woods, or ancient villages? Or could they just as easily lurk in the cozy, bustling neighborhoods we call home? This week's tale comes from Oak Ridge, a quaint little town in upstate New York. Picturesque, serene, and brimming with charm, Oak Ridge has always seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. But beneath its postcard-perfect exterior lies a dark history, a tale of betrayal, tragedy, and a curse that refuses to rest. And at the heart of it is a girl named Laura Anderson. Some say Laura was just another victim of stress, her mind snapping under the pressures of modern life. Others believe something far more sinister was at play. So, turn off your lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into the darkness that hides in plain sight. This is the story of Laura Anderson and the curse of Oak Ridge. The Anderson family was the epitome of suburban bliss. Mr. Anderson, a financial analyst, spent his weekdays poring over spreadsheets and his weekends tending to his immaculate lawn. Mrs. Anderson, a retired teacher, channeled her energy into volunteer work at the local library and keeping their pristine home in order. Laura, their only child, was the apple of their eye, a bright, talented sophomore at the local community college with dreams of becoming a writer. Oak Ridge was where people came to escape the chaos of the city. Rows of white picket fences lined streets with names like Maple Grove and Rosewood Lane, where every house seemed to have been plucked from a Norman Rockwell painting. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved to one another, children played safely in cul-de-sacs, and the biggest scandal was someone forgetting to mow their lawn for 2 weeks. But even perfect towns had their secrets. Every townsperson had heard whispers about the cursed Rosewood Mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. Built in the 1800s, it had stood as a reminder of the town's wealthier days. Its last known resident, Abigail Rosewood, had been accused of witchcraft during a bout of hysteria that swept the town in the late 19th century. Abigail's death was violent. Some said she was hanged by a mob under the light of a full moon. Others claimed she burned alive in her home. Either way, her death birthed a legend. Abigail's restless spirit haunted Oak Ridge, and those who crossed her path would face her wrath. Most dismissed the story as mere folklore. After all, nothing supernatural ever seemed to happen in Oak Ridge, until it did. It was a brisk October night when Laura's screams pierced the quiet serenity of the Anderson household. "Let go of me!" Laura's voice was raw, filled with a terror that sent Mrs. Anderson sprinting down the hallway to her daughter's room. She burst through the door to find Laura tangled in her bedsheets, her face pale, her wide eyes darting around the room as though searching for something unseen. "Laura!" Mrs. Anderson rushed to her daughter's side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "What's wrong? Did you have a nightmare?" Laura clutched her head, shaking it violently. "It wasn't just a dream, Mom. I felt it. Something grabbed my hair and pulled me. It was so real." Mrs. Anderson sighed, relieved that it was nothing more than a bad dream. She gently stroked Laura's hair, offering her the kind of comfort only a mother could. "Honey, you've been so stressed lately with your classes. It's probably just your imagination running wild. Why don't I get you some water and you try to go back to sleep?" But when Laura glanced down at her trembling hands, her breath caught. A small clump of her own hair rested there, the strands frayed as though ripped straight from her scalp. "Mom," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible, "this isn't just stress." The next morning, Laura trudged into the kitchen, dark circles under her eyes and a heaviness in her steps that hadn't been there before. "You look awful, sweetheart," Mr. Anderson said, glancing up from his newspaper. "Did you get any sleep?" Laura shook her head, sinking into a chair. "I kept hearing noises, like whispers. I don't know, maybe I'm just losing it." Mrs. Anderson placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her daughter, her brows furrowed with concern. "You're not losing it, Laura. But maybe we should take a break from all these horror movies and late-night writing sessions. They're clearly messing with your mind." "I wasn't watching anything last night," Laura muttered. "It's not just in my head, Mom. Something is wrong." Mrs. Anderson exchanged a worried glance with her husband, but said nothing. As the day wore on, Laura tried to shake the feeling of being watched. At college, her friends Emma and Sophie teased her for looking so distracted. "You're probably just tired," Emma said, draping an arm around her. "You should come to my birthday party this weekend. It'll be fun, and we can talk about literally anything but college." Laura forced a smile and agreed, but deep down, she couldn't escape the sensation that someone or something was watching her from the shadows. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they weren't just whispers. Laura sat at her desk, textbooks spread open in front of her, the blue glow of her desk lamp illuminating the room. Outside, the October night was unnervingly still, the kind of silence that makes every creak of the house sound deafening. She rubbed her temples and stared at the same line of text she'd been rereading for the past 15 minutes. Concentration had become impossible lately. Her thoughts felt like static, disjointed, and full of fragments she couldn't piece together. Then it came again. A faint whisper, soft and insistent, drifted into her ears. It wasn't a sound that came from outside. It was close, almost inside her head. "Laura." Her breath hitched. She jerked around, her chair scraping the hardwood floor. No one was there. The room was exactly as it should have been, neatly arranged with posters of her favorite bands on the walls, her bed perfectly made. Everything seemed normal, yet her heart pounded as though she'd just run a marathon. "Get it together," she muttered, forcing herself to turn back to her desk. But as her eyes returned to her notebook, she froze. Words had appeared on the blank page, scrawled in an unfamiliar handwriting. "Come to me." Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly backed away from the desk, knocking over her chair in the process. A loud thud echoed through the room as it hit the floor. "Mom!" she screamed, bolting for the door. Mrs. Anderson appeared almost instantly, her face pale with alarm. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" Laura pointed a trembling finger at her notebook. It wrote something. I didn't write that." Mrs. Anderson frowned, picking up the notebook and turning it around. Her expression softened, concern mixing with a hint of exasperation. "Sweetheart, there's nothing here." Laura stared at the now blank page in disbelief. "No, I swear it was there. It said, come to me." Her mother wrapped an arm around her, leading her toward the bed. "You've been under so much stress, Laura. Stress can play tricks on the mind. I think you're imagining things. Let's get you some rest." "I'm not imagining this," Laura insisted, but her voice wavered. Mrs. Anderson gave her a worried look, but she didn't press further. "Just try to sleep, honey. Things will look better in the morning." By the time Saturday rolled around, the tension in the Anderson household was palpable. Mr. Anderson had tried to distract Laura with small talk at breakfast, but every word felt forced, his jokes landing flat. Laura's mother hovered over her like a shadow, offering tea, snacks, and unsolicited advice. "You've been so on edge, Laura," Mrs. Anderson said, following her daughter into the living room. "Maybe you should skip Emma's party tonight." Laura groaned. "Mom, I'll be fine. I just need a break. Being cooped up here is making it worse." Her mother hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but promise me you'll come home early." "I will," Laura said, grabbing her jacket and heading for the door. The crisp night air nipped at her skin as Laura climbed into Emma's car, where Emma and Sophie were already waiting. "Hey, you made it!" Emma beamed, cranking up the music. "This party is going to be epic." Laura managed a smile, but her mind was elsewhere. The mansion loomed like a shadow against the night sky, its Gothic architecture stark against the faint light of the crescent moon. Built in the 1800s, it was a relic of the town's golden era, long abandoned and shrouded in whispered tales of hauntings. "Why does Emma's cousin even own this place?" Laura asked as they approached the front door. Sophie shrugged. "Who cares? It's the perfect spot for a party." Inside, the party was in full swing. The grand hall was dimly lit, with colourful strobe lights casting eerie shadows across the walls. The smell of spiked punch and cheap cologne mingled in the air as music thumped loud enough to rattle the chandelier. For a while, Laura managed to relax. She even joined Sophie on the makeshift dance floor, laughing as Emma tried to show off her questionable dance moves. But then everything changed. It started with the lights. The strobe lights flickered erratically before plunging the room into darkness. A collective groan rose from the partygoers. "Relax, everyone," Emma shouted. "It's just the circuit breaker. Give me a sec." But before Emma could move, a low, guttural whisper echoed through the room. "Laura." Laura's stomach dropped. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Sophie. "Hear what?" Sophie replied, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "The power's out. It's probably just the wind." But Laura wasn't convinced. The voice had been too distinct, too deliberate. Before she could respond, the lights snapped back on, casting the room in an unnerving brightness. Gasps rippled through the crowd as everyone turned toward the swimming pool. A girl stood at the pool's edge, her body rigid and her head tilted unnaturally to the side. It was Laura. She blinked, confused, as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. "How did I—" She stepped back, only to feel her foot slip. "Laura!" Emma screamed as Laura toppled into the water with a splash. Sophie and a few others rushed to the edge, pulling Laura from the water as she sputtered and gasped for air. Her body was freezing to the touch, and her lips were almost blue. "What the hell just happened?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. Laura couldn't answer. She didn't even remember walking to the pool. Mrs. Anderson flung open the door as soon as Laura arrived, shivering and drenched. "What happened?" she demanded, ushering Laura inside. I don't know," Laura said, her voice distant. "One minute I was dancing and the next I was in the pool." Mrs. Anderson didn't press for details, but her expression betrayed her fear. "You're staying home from now on, Laura. No more parties." Laura didn't argue. That night, as she lay in bed, a familiar sound reached her ears. "Laura." The whisper was louder now, more insistent. Her body trembled as an icy draft swept through the room, though her windows were closed. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, invading her mind. And then, as if to mock her fear, the same words from her notebook appeared on her bedroom wall. "Come to me." Laura sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at her mother as if waiting for permission to speak. The house felt unnaturally quiet that morning. Even the faint sounds of birdsong outside couldn't drown out the weight of the tension hanging in the air. Mrs. Anderson placed a steaming cup of tea in front of her daughter. "You need to tell me everything, Laura," she said, her voice steady but lined with worry. Laura hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "Mom, something's wrong. I don't feel like myself anymore." "What do you mean?" I hear things," Laura confessed, her voice trembling. "Whispers. At first I thought it was my imagination, but they won't stop. And last night, after the party, I saw the words again, on my wall. They were the same as in my notebook." "What words?" Laura's face paled as she whispered, "Come to me." Mrs. Anderson froze, the blood draining from her face. She quickly recovered, brushing a strand of hair from Laura's face. "Sweetheart, we'll figure this out. Maybe it's stress or exhaustion. Your father and I will help you through this." Laura nodded but didn't look convinced. As the day progressed, Laura's mood shifted. She became quieter, retreating to her room without so much as a word. Mrs. Anderson tried to coax her out for lunch, but Laura merely stared at the wall, her movements slow and deliberate. When Mr. Anderson came home, his wife filled him in on everything. He listened intently, his brow furrowed in confusion and concern. "Maybe we should call Dr. Brooks again," he suggested. "If it's a mental health issue, he'll know what to do." Mrs. Anderson nodded reluctantly. That night, while her parents discussed what to do next, Laura sat in her darkened room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent than before. She didn't fight them this time. When her mother knocked on her door later to check on her, Laura's voice came soft and mechanical. "I'm fine, Mum. Just tired." Satisfied, Mrs. Anderson walked away, but something about Laura's tone sent a chill down her spine. The following morning, the house seemed different. Mrs. Anderson woke to find strange symbols drawn on the mirrors and walls of the house in what looked like charcoal. They were intricate and foreign, nothing she recognized. "Laura!" she called, her voice trembling. Laura emerged from her room, her expression eerily calm. "Did you do this?" Mrs. Anderson demanded, pointing to the symbols. Laura tilted her head, her eyes distant. "What do you mean?" "These markings, they're everywhere." "I didn't do anything," Laura said flatly, brushing past her mother as though the conversation was irrelevant. Mrs. Anderson was left standing in the hallway, unnerved. By the afternoon, Mrs. Anderson's unease had grown into full-blown fear. Laura had taken to sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television while a static-filled screen flickered in front of her. "Honey, the TV isn't even on," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice quaking. Laura didn't respond. Mrs. Anderson cautiously approached, her heart pounding. She reached out to touch her daughter's shoulder when Laura suddenly turned her head, her eyes burning with an intensity that wasn't her own. "I told you to leave me alone," Laura snarled, her voice guttural and distorted. Mrs. Anderson stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table. "Laura!" she cried, tears welling in her eyes. But Laura didn't look like Laura anymore. Her skin had taken on a pallid hue, and her once bright eyes now glinted with a feral light. She tilted her head back and let out a sound that was somewhere between laughter and a growl. The lights in the room flickered violently before shattering, plunging the house into darkness. Terrified, Mrs. Anderson called Dr. Brooks and begged him to come immediately. When the family doctor arrived, Laura seemed normal again, sitting quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands. Dr. Brooks glanced at Mrs. Anderson, his expression skeptical. "You said she was acting strangely." "She was," Mrs. Anderson insisted, her voice desperate. Laura looked up at the doctor, her eyes wide and innocent. "I think my mum's just stressed," she said softly. Dr. Brooks frowned but said nothing. After examining Laura and finding nothing physically wrong, he pulled Mrs. Anderson aside. "She seems fine to me. I don't see any reason for concern." "Fine?" Mrs. Anderson hissed. "She growled at me earlier, and the lights—" "Sometimes when people are under stress, they misinterpret events," Dr. Brooks said gently. "Maybe you need some rest too." Mrs. Anderson glared at him but didn't argue. As Dr. Brooks left, he passed Laura, who gave him a small, enigmatic smile. Desperate for answers, Mrs. Anderson turned to the town's history, spending hours at the local library. What she found sent shivers down her spine. Abigail Rosewood, the last resident of the infamous mansion, had been accused of witchcraft in the late 19th century. Though the charges were unsubstantiated, a mob had dragged her from her home and hanged her under a rosewood tree in the mansion's garden. Legend had it that Abigail had cursed the town with her dying breath, vowing that her spirit would find those who crossed into her domain. Over the years, residents whispered about strange occurrences, particularly involving young women who visited the mansion. Mrs. Anderson's stomach turned as she realized Laura might have been targeted. Late that night, Mrs. Anderson was jolted awake by a loud thud. Heart racing, she rushed to Laura's room, only to find it empty. A strange sound, like heavy breathing, echoed from the kitchen. "Laura?" Mrs. Anderson called out, her voice trembling. When she entered the kitchen, her breath caught in her throat. Laura was hanging upside down from the ceiling, her long hair brushing the floor. Her arms hung limply, but her head snapped up at the sound of her mother's voice. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and her lips twisted into a grin that didn't belong to her. "Laura!" Mrs. Anderson screamed, frozen in place. Laura began to laugh, a deep, menacing sound that echoed through the house. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, and Mr. Anderson rushed in, his face pale as he took in the horrifying scene. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted. Before Mrs. Anderson could respond, Laura let out an ear-piercing shriek and dropped to the floor with inhuman grace. She turned to face her parents, her body moving in jerky, unnatural motions. "Get out of here!" Mrs. Anderson screamed at her husband. But it was too late. Laura lunged at him, her hands outstretched like claws. Laura lunged at Mr. Anderson with a speed that defied logic, her body twisting unnaturally as she closed the distance between them. Her hands clamped onto his shoulders, nails digging into his skin with a strength that left him gasping in pain. "Laura, stop!" he shouted, trying to pry her hands away. But the girl before him wasn't his daughter anymore. Her lips curled into a snarl, and a guttural voice emerged, layered and inhuman. "You don't belong here," it growled. Mrs. Anderson screamed, grabbing the first thing within reach, a cast-iron skillet. She swung it with all her might, the impact landing squarely on Laura's shoulder. Laura released her father and staggered back, hissing like a cornered animal. Her glowing eyes darted between her parents before she dropped to all fours and scuttled out of the kitchen, disappearing into the darkness of the house. "What the hell just happened?" Mr. Anderson gasped, clutching his shoulder. Mrs. Anderson was trembling, the skillet still clutched in her hands. "That wasn't Laura," she whispered. "That was something else." The Andersons barricaded themselves in their bedroom, shoving the dresser against the door. They sat in silence, their ears straining for any sound. "I told you something was wrong," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We should have done something sooner." Mr. Anderson nodded, his face pale. "We'll figure it out. First thing tomorrow, we're getting help." But the night offered little reprieve. Outside their barricaded door, they heard heavy footsteps pacing the hallway. Occasionally, a low growl would reverberate through the air, followed by Laura's distorted voice, muttering words in a language neither of them recognized. Neither parent slept. By morning, the house was eerily quiet. The Andersons cautiously emerged from their room, armed with kitchen knives. "Laura!" Mrs. Anderson called out, her voice quivering. There was no response. They searched the house, finding overturned furniture, scratches on the walls, and shattered glass. Laura's room was in complete disarray. Her bed was overturned, and her desk lamp lay in pieces on the floor. "She's not here," Mr. Anderson said, his stomach sinking. Before they could decide what to do next, the doorbell rang, making them both jump. Dr. Brooks stood on the porch, his expression concerned. "You called me last night," he said. "What happened?" Mrs. Anderson pulled him inside, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Something's wrong with Laura. She's not herself. She attacked us, and now she's gone." Dr. Brooks raised a hand to calm her. "Let's take a breath. If Laura's having a psychotic break, it's critical we remain rational. I'll help you find her, but we need to act carefully." As they discussed their next steps, a loud crash echoed from the garage. The Andersons and Dr. Brooks froze. "She's back," Mr. Anderson whispered. They approached the garage cautiously, their steps muffled on the carpeted floor. Mrs. Anderson clutched her husband's arm as he slowly opened the door. Inside, Laura crouched on the concrete floor, surrounded by shards of broken tools and debris. She turned her head sharply, her glowing eyes locking onto them. "Get out," she hissed, her voice layered with malevolent tones. Dr. Brooks stepped forward, his professional demeanor faltering. "Laura, it's me, Dr. Brooks. I want to help you." Laura's lips twisted into a chilling smile. "Help me?" she said mockingly. "You can't help what's already claimed." Before anyone could react, Laura lunged at Dr. Brooks, tackling him to the ground. Her hands wrapped around his throat as he struggled beneath her. Mr. Anderson grabbed a shovel, striking Laura across the back. She let out an inhuman shriek and collapsed, motionless. "Is she—" Mrs. Anderson began, her voice shaking. Dr. Brooks coughed and shook his head. "She's unconscious, for now." With Laura restrained and sedated, Dr. Brooks finally admitted he was out of his depth. "This isn't something I've seen before," he confessed, dabbing at the scratches on his neck. "We need someone who specializes in unconventional cases." Mrs. Anderson's thoughts immediately went to the Rosewood Mansion and Abigail's curse. "There's something I need to show you," she said, pulling out the research she'd compiled from the library. She explained the story of Abigail Rosewood, the accusations of witchcraft, and the curse that had supposedly plagued the town ever since. Dr. Brooks frowned as he sifted through the papers. "If there's any truth to this, it's possible Laura is being influenced by something paranormal, but we'll need an expert to confirm that." He made a call to an old colleague, Dr. Avner, a psychiatrist who had built a reputation for blending traditional medicine with investigations into the occult. Dr. Avner arrived that evening, a tall, sharp-featured man with an air of quiet authority. He wasted no time inspecting the symbols on the walls and listening intently to the Andersons' accounts. "I've seen cases like this before," he said finally. "It's possession. And if this spirit is tied to Abigail Rosewood, it's not going to release Laura willingly." "What do we do?" Mr. Anderson asked, desperation in his voice. Dr. Avner folded his hands. "We need to perform a séance to confront the spirit and sever its connection to Laura. But you need to understand, it will be dangerous. The spirit won't go quietly." Despite their fear, the Andersons agreed. That night, the house was plunged into darkness. Dr. Avner arranged candles in a circle in the living room, placing Laura, still sedated, in the center. The Andersons sat at the edge of the circle, their hands trembling as they followed Dr. Avner's instructions. The séance began with quiet chanting. At first, nothing happened. Then the air grew heavy, the temperature plummeted, and the candles flickered violently. Laura's body convulsed. Her eyes snapped open, glowing like molten embers. "You dare summon me?" the voice boomed, echoing through the house. Dr. Avner remained calm. "Abigail Rosewood, your vengeance has corrupted the innocent. Release this girl and move on." Laura's head twisted unnaturally, and her lips curled into a sneer. "You cannot command me. She is mine." The candles extinguished, plunging the room into pitch blackness. The Andersons clung to each other, their hearts racing as objects around them began to shake and shatter. Dr. Avner continued chanting, his voice steady despite the chaos. Laura screamed, a sound so piercing it felt like it would shatter their eardrums. Her body levitated above the circle, thrashing violently. "Abigail!" Dr. Avner shouted, his voice booming. "Your time is over!" With a final deafening scream, Laura collapsed to the ground. When the candles reignited, Laura lay motionless in the center of the circle. "Is she—" Mrs. Anderson whispered, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Avner knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "She's alive," he said. "But the spirit isn't gone. We've only weakened it. To truly free her, we must find the source of Abigail's power." Mrs. Anderson's heart sank as she realized where they would have to go next: the Rosewood Mansion. Laura lay unconscious on the living room floor, her breathing shallow but steady. The séance had taken its toll, leaving her parents shaken and Dr. Avner grim-faced. "It isn't over," Dr. Avner said, his voice low. "Abigail's spirit is deeply entrenched. If we don't sever the connection entirely, it will consume Laura completely." Mrs. Anderson's voice quivered. "What do we have to do?" "We need to find Abigail's remains," Dr. Avner explained. "They're the source of her power. If we can locate them and perform the banishment ritual, we can release Laura from her grasp." Mr. Anderson frowned. "But the mansion has been abandoned for years. How do we even know where to look?" "Her remains are likely buried under the rosewood tree where she was hanged," Dr. Avner replied. "We don't have time to hesitate. Every moment we wait, Abigail grows stronger." Mrs. Anderson glanced at Laura's pale face and nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes." Night had fallen by the time they arrived at the Rosewood Mansion. The towering structure loomed against the moonlit sky, its broken windows and crumbling facade adding to its ominous aura. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. The surrounding forest seemed to close in around them, the rustling of leaves like whispers warning them to turn back. "I don't like this," Mr. Anderson muttered as they stepped out of the car. "No one does," Dr. Avner replied, clutching a leather satchel filled with ritual supplies. "But we don't have a choice." They carried Laura between them, her unconscious body limp and unresponsive. Her parents exchanged worried glances as they followed Dr. Avner up the cracked stone steps and through the creaking front door. The interior of the mansion was as foreboding as the exterior. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped across the broken furniture like shrouds. The air was icy cold, and their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the vast, empty space. "We'll set up here, Doctor," Avner said, indicating the grand hall. "The rosewood tree is in the courtyard out back, but first we need to prepare Laura." Dr. Avner laid Laura on the dusty floor, encircling her with a ring of salt. He lit black candles at each cardinal point and began arranging herbs, crystals, and a small iron dagger within the circle. Mrs. Anderson knelt beside Laura, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "She's so cold," she whispered. "That's Abigail," Dr. Avner said grimly. "She's drawing Laura's life force into herself." Mr. Anderson stood by the shattered windows, scanning the shadowed courtyard beyond. "How do we know if this will work?" Dr. Avner didn't look up. "We don't, but it's our only chance." He began chanting in a low, resonant tone, the words foreign and guttural. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier with each syllable. A sudden wind tore through the hall, extinguishing the candles and scattering the salt circle. The temperature plummeted, and a piercing shriek echoed through the mansion, shaking its very foundation. "She knows we're here," Dr. Avner said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Laura's body convulsed violently, her back arching off the ground. Her eyes flew open, glowing with a malevolent light. "You think you can banish me?" A voice boomed from her lips, layered and inhuman. "This body is mine now. Stay strong," Dr. Avner shouted, relighting the candles with trembling hands. Mrs. Anderson clung to her husband, tears streaming down her face. "We have to help her." Dr. Avner's chanting grew louder, the words flowing faster as he poured all his energy into the ritual. Laura screamed, her voice a mixture of her own and Abigail's, as dark tendrils of shadow began to rise from her body. The ritual inside wasn't enough. Abigail's power was too strong. "We have to go to the source," Dr. Avner yelled. "The tree." Grabbing the satchel, he led the Andersons out to the courtyard, carrying Laura between them. The rosewood tree stood in the center, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. Dr. Avner knelt at the base of the tree, pulling out a trowel. "Help me dig. Her remains are here." Mr. Anderson dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with his hands. Mrs. Anderson stood guard, clutching the iron dagger, her eyes darting nervously around the shadowed courtyard. As they dug, the ground seemed to resist them, the soil unnaturally dense and cold. A faint laughter echoed through the trees, growing louder and more menacing. "She's coming," Mrs. Anderson whispered. Suddenly, Laura's body went rigid. Her eyes snapped open, glowing brighter than ever. She let out a guttural scream, and the shadows around the courtyard seemed to come alive. Abigail's ghostly form emerged from the darkness, her face twisted in rage. Her translucent figure hovered above them, her long, tattered dress billowing as though caught in an unseen wind. "You cannot take her from me!" Abigail shrieked. Dr. Avner stood, holding the iron dagger aloft. "Abigail Rosewood, your curse ends here. Return to the darkness." Abigail let out a laugh that chilled them to the bone. "You cannot stop me. She is mine, and so are you." The wind whipped around them, and the ground trembled. "Keep digging," Dr. Avner yelled. Mr. Anderson struck something solid. He reached down and unearthed a small, decayed coffin. "I found it!" Abigail screamed, her form flickering and distorting. "No, you dare disturb my rest?" Dr. Avner pulled the coffin open, revealing a skeleton wrapped in tattered fabric. He began sprinkling salt and herbs over the remains, chanting with fervor. Abigail's form lunged at Dr. Avner, but Mrs. Anderson stepped in front of him, holding the iron dagger. "Leave my daughter alone!" she shouted, plunging the dagger into Abigail's chest. The ghost let out a blood-curdling scream, her form dissolving into black smoke. Laura's body collapsed, the glowing light fading from her eyes. The wind ceased, and the courtyard fell silent. Dr. Avner closed the coffin and placed a protective seal over it. "It's over," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Abigail is gone." Mrs. Anderson cradled Laura in her arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. "She's safe," she whispered. As dawn broke, the Andersons left the mansion, their ordeal finally behind them. The Rosewood mansion stood eerily still in the pale light of dawn, but the Andersons knew their battle wasn't over. Though Abigail's spirit had been weakened during the ritual, Laura's condition remained fragile. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold, and her pulse faint. "We've only bought ourselves time," Dr. Avner warned as he guided Mr. and Mrs. Anderson back into the mansion. "Abigail's influence still lingers. To banish her completely, we must destroy what ties her spirit to this world." "What does that mean?" Mrs. Anderson asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Avner hesitated, glancing at the courtyard where Abigail's remains lay buried. "We need to uncover the source of her curse. The truth about what happened to Abigail must come to light." Inside the mansion, the air grew heavy, the silence broken only by their hesitant footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Dr. Avner led them to the grand hall, where he began examining the walls, searching for something unseen. "What are you looking for?" Mr. Anderson asked. "The Rosewood family was notorious for their secrets," Dr. Avner explained. "Abigail's curse didn't begin with her death. It's rooted in something deeper, something this house is hiding." After several minutes of searching, His hand brushed against a section of the wall that sounded hollow. He pressed against it, revealing a hidden door concealed beneath layers of peeling wallpaper. "Here," Dr. Avner said, his voice tight with urgency. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying the faint scent of decay. "I'll go first," Dr. Avner said, lighting a lantern he'd brought. "Stay close and don't touch anything." The staircase descended into a vast underground chamber. The air was damp and suffused with a metallic tang. The flickering lantern light revealed shelves lined with books, jars of unknown substances, and strange symbols etched into the stone walls. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface stained dark with age. Above it hung a portrait of Abigail Rosewood, her painted eyes sharp and accusing. Mrs. Anderson shivered. "What is this place?" "A ritual chamber," Dr. Avner said grimly. "The Rosewood family practiced dark magic. Abigail wasn't the first. She was just the last." He moved toward the altar, his eyes scanning the symbols carved into its surface. "This is where the curse began. Abigail's family performed a ritual to bind their power to this land, but when the townspeople killed her, the ritual corrupted her soul. She became the anchor for their unfinished spell." "Can we stop it?" Mr. Anderson asked. Dr. Avner nodded. "If we destroy this altar and sever the connection to Abigail's spirit, the curse will break. But it won't be easy." As they prepared to dismantle the altar, a cold wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing the lantern. "Do you think you can erase me?" Abigail's voice boomed, her form materializing in the darkness. Her ghostly figure was larger now, more menacing, her features twisted with rage. "You will not take this from me!" she screamed. Laura's body, still cradled in Mrs. Anderson's arms, began to convulse. Her eyes flew open, glowing with the same malevolent light as before. Abigail's voice echoed through her lips. "This body belongs to me." "Hold her down," Dr. Avner shouted, grabbing a vial of holy water from his satchel. Mrs. Anderson clung to Laura, tears streaming down her face as her daughter thrashed violently. Mr. Anderson rushed to help, pinning Laura's arms as Dr. Avner sprinkled the holy water over her. Laura screamed, her voice mingling with Abigail's as her body arched unnaturally. Dr. Avner turned to the altar, chanting in the ancient tongue he'd used during the séance. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with his words. Abigail's spirit let out a deafening shriek, her form flickering as the symbol's light intensified. As the chanting reached its peak, the chamber began to tremble. The ground cracked beneath the altar, revealing a hidden compartment. Dr. Avner pried it open, revealing a blackened book bound in what appeared to be human skin. "The grimoire," he muttered. "This is the key to the curse." Abigail's spirit roared in fury. "Leave it! You cannot destroy what is eternal." Ignoring her, Dr. Avner opened the book, flipping through its pages. Each page was filled with macabre illustrations and cryptic incantations, but one entry caught his eye, a spell detailing Abigail's death and the curse she cast in her final moments. "It's all here," he said. "The curse ties her spirit to this altar. If we burn the book, her connection will break." As Dr. Avner prepared to destroy the grimoire, Abigail's spirit launched a final attack. Her spectral form swept through the chamber, knocking over shelves and hurling objects at the group. Mrs. Anderson shielded Laura, who had gone limp again, while Mr. Anderson grabbed a broken piece of wood, swinging it futilely at the ghost. Dr. Avner poured salt and oil over the grimoire, striking a match. "No!" Abigail howled, her voice cracking with desperation. The flames licked at the ancient pages, consuming the grimoire as Abigail's screams grew louder. Her form began to disintegrate, unraveling like smoke caught in a gale. With a final, ear-splitting wail, Abigail's spirit was torn apart, vanishing into the void. The chamber fell silent. Laura stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mom," she whispered weakly. Mrs. Anderson sobbed, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. "You're safe now. It's over." Dr. Avner extinguished the smouldering remains of the grimoire, his expression weary but relieved. "The curse is broken," he said. "Abigail is gone for good." The Andersons helped Laura to her feet, guiding her out of the chamber and back into the light of dawn. News of the events at the Rosewood Mansion spread quickly through Oakridge, sparking debates and rumors. Some dismissed it as superstition, while others whispered about the family that had dared to confront the curse and lived to tell the tale. The Andersons chose to move away, leaving the horrors of Oakridge behind. As they drove out of town, Laura glanced at the mansion one last time. In the rearview mirror, she thought she saw Abigail's silhouette in the upstairs window, watching them leave. But when she blinked, it was gone. The Anderson family settled into a modest house in a quiet suburb far from Oakridge. The picturesque streets, with their manicured lawns and cheerful neighbors, seemed worlds away from the horrors they had endured. Yet, despite the change in scenery, the trauma of the Rosewood Mansion lingered. Laura had been quiet during the move, her once bright and curious demeanor dulled. She spent most of her time in her room, staring out the window as though expecting something or someone to appear. Mrs. Anderson tried to coax her out of her shell with favorite meals and small outings, but Laura remained distant. "She's been through so much," Mrs. Anderson confided to her husband one night as they sat in the living room. "I don't know if she'll ever be the same." Mr. Anderson nodded solemnly. "None of us will, but we'll get through this. We have to." While her parents clung to hope, Laura's nights were haunted. Each time she closed her eyes, she was transported back to the mansion, the suffocating darkness of the hidden chamber, Abigail's piercing shrieks, and the sensation of losing control of her own body. In one recurring dream, Laura stood beneath the rosewood tree, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Abigail's ghostly figure loomed above her, whispering unintelligible words. Laura would wake up drenched in sweat, her hands trembling and her heart racing. One night, she awoke with a start, her breath coming in shallow gasps. A faint voice echoed in her mind, one she hadn't heard since the séance. "Come to me." Laura sat bolt upright, her eyes darting around the darkened room. It was empty, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Concerned for Laura's well-being, Mrs. Anderson reached out to Dr. Avner, who agreed to visit their new home. When he arrived, he found Laura sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon. "Laura," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside her, "how are you feeling?" Laura shrugged. "Tired, like something's missing." Dr. Avner studied her carefully. "It's normal to feel that way after what you've been through, but you're stronger than you realize. Abigail is gone. She can't hurt you anymore." "Then why do I still hear her?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Avner frowned. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes when it's quiet I hear her voice. It's faint, but it's there." The doctor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "The mind can play tricks after a traumatic event. You've faced something most people can't even imagine. It'll take time, but those echoes will fade." Laura didn't look convinced. One crisp spring morning, Laura ventured into the backyard, the soft sunlight warming her skin. She stood barefoot in the grass, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. But as she turned to go back inside, she froze. There, at the edge of the yard, was a single rose bush. Its blood-red blooms were vibrant against the greenery, and the air around it carried a faint, familiar scent. Laura's chest tightened. "No," she whispered, stepping back. "It's not possible." Her parents found her minutes later, sitting on the ground, staring at the rosebush with tears streaming down her face. "What is it, honey?" Mrs. Anderson asked, kneeling beside her. "It's her," Laura said, her voice trembling. "She's still here." That night, Laura dreamed of the rosewood tree again. But this time it was different. She wasn't alone. A figure stood beside her, a woman with sharp eyes and a cold smile. "Did you think you could escape me?" Abigail whispered, her voice cutting through the silence. Laura woke with a scream, her parents rushing to her side. "It's just a dream," Mrs. Anderson said, holding her tightly. But Laura knew better. In the corner of the room, the faint outline of a figure lingered, watching. As the rain began to fall outside, Abigail's words echoed once more in Laura's mind. "Come to me." Thank you very much, friends. I will see you on the next podcast.